Greetings, greetings everyone. Welcome to this event organized by the International Copper Association. My name is Laurent Chocoilet. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at the International Copper Association, ICA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this first of collaborating with LinkedIn to produce a LinkedIn Live event. It's actually one of the first for LinkedIn too. So if you leave this place with paint on your hands, it's because it wasn't dry. I happen not to see anyone right now. It's a bit of a dark tube for me. So if you'd be so kind to let us know in the LinkedIn chat box where you're calling in from, that would be appreciated. We'd like to know about you, know from you, and hopefully stay in touch going forward. Why we organized this event? As the copper industry and the part of the copper value chain, we see our agenda day after day, week after week, year after year, more towards a more sustainability labeled one where the ways of the past are gauged against the sustainability challenges that the industry and the planet altogether are facing. Part of that is, of course, to do with the climate change concerns, the biodiversity concerns, the energy sustainability concerns, and the role that copper plays in it, both in terms of production and as a material. One of the issues, of course, that has been quite salient over the last years is the linearity of the global economy and how unsustainable it is going forward, and what sort of measures should be taken to tame that and arrive at I guess, more durable patterns of producing and growing. And so copper has a role to play in this. And this is why we created this campaign called Circular Copper, and this event that is building a culture of sustainability without waste. Today is the opportunity to discuss the role of the copper industry in circularity and zoom in a little bit on something which we call internally, and I guess this is terminology that's gaining prominence in general, talk about the urban mine, some of the challenges and opportunities of the urban mine. And to do so, we've invited three distinguished speakers, some from our membership, some from the outside world, should I say. And so I will introduce them to you in turn right now. First up, Kunal Sinha is a member of the organization via his company, Glencore. And Kunal is the global commercial lead at Glencore Recycling, and he will give us his company's perspective on the challenges and opportunities of copper in the circular economy. We've also invited, and he accepted, and we're pleased that he did, David McGinty. David is the global director for the platform for accelerating the circular economy, also known as SPACE. SPACE was created under the auspices of the World Economic Forum, and it is hosted within the World Resources Institute. David will walk us through his organization's current agenda when it comes to the circular economy, and also talk a little bit about the state of the circular economy as a concept on the ground. And then finally, and I'd say last but not least, our very own Adam Estelle from the Copper Development Association, which is the North American or US member of the International Copper Association. And Adam will take us deep down into the urban mine to talk about some of the practical challenges of recycling, collecting, in fact, processing and recycling copper and other materials from that urban mine. So this is very much the start of a conversation. As I said, we'd like to hear from you. The format that we intend on using here is an interactive one. So we let speakers take their turn and present their perspective. Then we will have a Q&A session, as long as we can make it. If ever during the course of any of the presentation you have a burning question, please feel free to post it in the chat. We will do our best to curate those and answer those on the spot or at Q&A time, depending. If for some reason, because let's admit it, it's a very short time that we'll spend together, we run out of time, we'll make very sure to get back to you separately after the event on any question that you may have left that we couldn't possibly answer. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you as a cue to the first presentation, a short video which we produced with our partner, the International Rock Copper Council, IWCC, which represents the world copper and copper alloy fabricating industry. That talks to our take on circular copper, and particularly the culture that we hope to see will flourish over time when it comes to circularity in our material.
Society must learn to treat waste as a resource before it's too late, and the circular economy is the golden opportunity to do so. Urban mines provide an abundance of secondary raw materials that can be recovered and recycled. For this to happen, adequate infrastructure, skills, market conditions, and economic incentives for recycling are all essential. Product designers should design for sustainability to facilitate recovery of metals when the product is ultimately recycled. Suppliers and manufacturers must work together to establish closed-loop recycling streams for metal scraps generated during manufacturing. Well-informed customers play a key role in ensuring end-of-life products are collected for recycling rather than sent to the landfill. Recyclers, meanwhile, are investing in cutting-edge technologies and innovative recycling processes to recover 20+ metals from complex copper products and applications. Together with the copper value chain and other partners, we can create a culture of responsibility, positive change and smart creation without waste. Only by joining forces will we be able to fulfill the true potential of circular copper. To see how we turn our partnerships into action, visit sustainablecopper.org.
So without further ado, thank you, Kunal, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you and a privilege. Please walk you through your company's take on circular copper and the sort of challenges and opportunities that you see and would like to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks the International Copper Association for sort of taking up the topic in the campaign, and of course having us talk about our experience and I guess our outlook. So maybe to start, we could go to the next slide. Very briefly, we'll touch upon Glencore. If you're not aware of Glencore, we are a fairly large, diversified natural resources company, and our purpose is responsibly sourcing the commodities that advance everyday life. We do that in two distinct sort of verticals. We have an industrials business, we have a marketing business, and then within our asset footprint, we operate in metals and minerals, as well as energy. And on the marketing side, we of course have the marketing of these commodities, but also the recycling. That's the part that I'm involved with. So I won't spend too much time on it. That's sort of our global footprint, some key numbers there, some key figures. In terms of copper, which is the topic of today, we are one of the larger copper producers as well as marketers out there. So, our perspective is from that point of view. So next slide. In terms of how we achieve our purpose, we have a business model that integrates all of those different parts of our business. We have an industrials business. Those are our assets in all of those metals, mining, and energy verticals. That's where we produce those commodities through various steps of production. That gets fed into our marketing business. That's the part of our business that makes sure then these commodities can reach where they're most needed. And then we close so-called the proverbial loop through our recycling business. So then we also help bring some of those commodities back after consumer use and put them back into our industrial businesses where they get recycled for a second, third, fourth life, and those commodities get put back into the loop onto the market. So that's sort of our business model. And if we move to the next slide, just want to spend more time on the recycling part. So, recycling at Glencore is not a new activity. I think the circular economy is certainly a newer phrase, and it's caught on more recently. But we have been we have been at it for a long time. So within the copper business, all of our copper metallurgical assets are fully capable of recycling, some more than others. But if you take one of our biggest assets, which is the Horns copper smelter in Canada, we have been recycling there for close to 75 years, pretty much after World War II. Now, what we recycle has changed. We have been recycling, and how and what we recycle keeps evolving. One of the large parts of our recycling business is the recycling of electronics. That business, pretty much the technology was pioneered by the Horn smelter in the 80s. Since then, we have processed more than 1 million tons of circuit boards and components from end-of-life electronics, and we have recovered metal, copper, and other precious metal from those electronics. So just wanted to clarify, the 1 million tons is not 1 million tons of discarded devices or electronics. It's 1 million tons of components and circuit boards and things that come out of those electronics. So in terms of our impact on preventing sort of end-of-life devices from going into landfills, that number in terms of number of devices or weight of devices probably several times that 1 million tons number. It's also a very, very good business. It is truly a sort of a circular economy business. There are some numbers on the slide about how much metal we recovered last year. That's fairly representative of how we have been doing in previous years. The other important thing to keep in mind is the copper that we produce from our recycling sources has 80% lower emissions footprint than mined copper. We of course do both, and we're trying to increase the recycled part. And then lastly, I think we've been doing a lot of work. We'll talk about it later in this talk. On this is the history. We've been doing that for 40 plus years. And where do we go from here? So we've participated in some really interesting industry conversations that resulted in the formation and launch of what's called the Circular Electronics Partnership. And we hope that will grow the circularity in this industry. So just in terms of our sort of presence and when we say what our view is, that comes from the fact that we are one of the oldest and the largest processors of end-of-life electronics. We are the largest in North America. In fact, we are the only integrated reverse supply chain from end-of-life electronics all the way to refined metals and PGM elements, all within North America. So if we move on to the next slide. Just quickly, it's not just electronics that we recycle. We also handle copper scrap. That's the more, I would say, more widely understood part of the scrap business. We do that. That's some people would view that as higher grade scrap, and e-waste might be viewed as lower grade scrap. It's definitely very difficult to handle. It's difficult to process. Much of e-waste is classified hazardous. So certainly not a easy reverse logistics business or even the metallurgical processing. So we're very fortunate to have those technology and people who have been working at it for several years, and we continue to do that. And then of course there's what we call smelter grade. That's sort of everything else that comes in form of either production waste or other waste which has copper. So we are operational in all of those segments. Electronics is the largest for us. In terms of just switching gear, that's sort of our history, some credentials on how much and what recycling we do. So just switching gears to where we are headed. In terms of where we see the world sort of going, I think we have made our commitment to be a net zero emissions company by 2050. We have put out a very comprehensive plan on how we'll get there. Our view in terms of how the world gets there is it will take effort in many different sectors, but the key is that we'll be transitioning to a sort of a low carbon energy scenario, and that low carbon energy scenario gets fueled by mature technologies like wind and solar, but also emerging technologies like EVs and lithium-ion batteries, storage upgrade of the grid, and things like those. The role that Glencore plans to play in this transition is to make sure we are able to provide and supply the key commodities, specifically these metals, that would be needed to be able to achieve that transition. I think we'll talk more about copper going forward, but copper plays a key role in this transition in our perspective. So to zoom in on copper, if you go to the next slide, I think one of the key aspects of net zero, this is sort of the global ambition, not just Glencore. We just need we need to decarbonize the energy demand, and I'm sure these numbers and these figures are familiar. The different publications, different research houses put out different numbers. We can debate these specific numbers, but the key is you need a step change in a lot of these metals in terms of their availability of the refined production. Copper may not have, you may not see the same jump in copper as nickel, cobalt, zinc, but it's still pretty significant. So we're saying from almost a 30 million ton refined market, we need to get to a 60 million ton refined market in the next 30 years. That's almost 1 million tons a year. You have to put that in perspective that at the moment, the investment in copper mines is actually at pre-super cycle lows. So the question really becomes, if copper is important for this transition, how are we going to get all that copper in the next sort of 30 years? So if we go to the next slide, and our view is, I think copper has a dual role to play. But before we get there, why copper, right? And I think, I'm an engineer by training, and I think my views, I think copper is still the best and the most practical conductor of electricity. And of all the efforts to get to a net zero, electrification is one of the biggest drivers. And if you have to get to electrification, then you need more copper. It's not classified as a critical metal, not here in the States where I am or in Europe. I think Canada does. So the question is, should it be, and what role copper plays? The alternatives to copper are gold and silver, which is obvious why you won't use a lot of gold or silver, or aluminum. Aluminum is already used, but aluminum has some limitations on form factor, shapes, and how much aluminum you need for the same amount of conductivity. So it's used in applications where it would make sense. But for everything else that we've talked about, the proliferation of wind, solar, compact devices, EVs, a lot of that will still need copper. So that's what drives the demand for copper. So I think it's very interesting when we talk about sustainable copper, circular copper, recycled copper. I think copper has a dual role to play because, conceptually, if you think about where we are today in 2021, and if you want to take those total emissions and get to net zero by 2050, as a society, you can only go so far with decarbonizing the energy part of it, right? So that will not take out all the emissions. There's a chunk of emissions. We can debate what percent it is, but a significant percent of those emissions come from not just from energy, the type of energy we use, but from the products. What products we use, how we use them, consumer behavior patterns, whether we are able to recycle them or not. That's the circular economy. So on the one hand, on the energy side, there's a 2x increase in refined copper demand in order to basically feed into these existing and emerging technologies that you need. And on the other hand, we think copper has a role to play in the circular economy in terms of sustainably recycling copper from waste to be able to feed into some of the 2x demand increase. So I think it's a very, very interesting metal in that perspective. It is needed to make the transition, and then it's also, if done properly, it's easily recyclable. So then you can actually achieve more with low carbon copper in the scenario. So it's an interesting dynamics that copper has. So if we move to the next slide, I think so then if we want to talk about where we are and where we need to be, and I'll make some comments on it's okay to talk about it, but what are we doing? So what is Glencore doing? I think where we are today, or have been in the past, I won't say today because that has already changed. We had a lot of linear thinking. So you have a linear approach to, how products are designed, used, made, and then discarded. Where we need to get to be is having circular goals like circular copper, like circular electronics, and many other sectors. And the reason it's important is then you need to bring the the product design and production closer to recycling, and so people can talk and understand what's going on, so that, if you have upstream ambitions, for example, if big tech has upstream ambitions of saying we want to use X% recycled content by 2030, or we want a transparent supply chain with recycling, then the actual entities that will support that, like recyclers and smelters, they need to be able to talk, right? So having that circularity helps. So what have we done? We worked over the last year with a lot of stakeholders. I'll refer to it in the next slide. Did a lot of good work, and we have this. We launched this circular electronics partnership. Very excited with what's going on, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Regulatory frameworks. I think we still looking at the end of the day. I mean, this is waste. You're moving waste to recycle it. So the current regulatory frameworks are pretty much focused on deterring movement of waste. They're not really focused on a circular economy policy. We are very cognizant that you can't relax those controls, but you still need to make sure that you are able to move those metals from where they are to where they need to get recycled, that scrap and that waste. So we are working on various policy organizations to raise awareness of that. And the last 2 points I would make is, so what are we doing, Glencore doing, in order to increase our capacity? We're actively working on increasing our capacity worldwide, but specifically we are looking at projects in the UK. So we'll be adding some onshore capacity in the UK for pre-processing electronics, as well as in continental Europe. And in the US, we have a brownfield site in Osceola, and we're looking at that site as well as other sites. If we bring that site online, depending on what we do, it could be it has the potential to be the largest site of its kind in North America to be able to handle recycling. And then we're obviously investing in our own technology on how to recycle more difficult types of urban waste and recover copper from it. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop there. Maybe we'll quickly just flash the next slide. It's a shout out to the Circular Electronics Partnership. A lot of good people have worked on it over the last year, various organizations, companies, and essentially, we're trying collectively to solve the problem of e-waste, which is the fastest growing waste stream in the world. And what we have put out is a 6-pathway framework for thinking about all the way from how do you design for circularity, to source responsibly with recycled content, to reverse logistics, to creating a secondary market. So a lot of good work went into defining it, and now a lot of good projects are coming out of it. You can see some very interesting names who have come together, both as organizations and member companies, to work on it. So sorry about stepping over time, but I'll hand it back to Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Kunal. Thanks for a fairly comprehensive overview of Glencore Recycling's activities and indeed partnerships. And without further ado, we'll reserve questions to you for the general Q&A part. I'm pleased to welcome David McGinty, Global Director of PACE. I introduced PACE at the beginning of this meeting, so I won't do it again. And presumably David may have a few words. So David, without interrupting you or stopping you or blocking you any further, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for having me. Yeah, just, leading PACE, which is this coalition of CEOs and ministers, it's quite an interesting perspective to get. We get to participate in things like the electronics partnership that Kunal was just mentioning with WBCSD and the World Economic Forum and some other close partners in the kind of civil society or coalition space. One of the things that I'll zoom back out. I'm not going to presume to be an expert in the industry and in copper or anything, except an expert in knowing a lot of people who are doing a lot of cool stuff, and kind of having an overview of things. So maybe I'll step back and even frame the work on circular economy a little bit, and where circularity is kind of as a movement, if you think of it that way. Even PACE's story itself was started about 10 years ago in the World Economic Forum. And at that time, this is building on a long legacy of momentum around regenerative agriculture. So if you talk about circular economy, you can find people talking about regenerative agriculture and industrial symbiosis. There was a movement around the economic opportunity of circularity. And I think that's what really started to catch about 7 or 8 years ago, was what the business opportunity, the innovation opportunity with things in business model innovation. So the shared economy, products as a service, those types of approaches. And then the next was kind of that wave of consumer awareness around plastics and what happened there. And I think what we're starting to see is a couple of other potential waves. And I would predict that the next is around electronics, and that there's going to be a lot of more awareness among consumers, but also action on corporates, and then a need for policy changes and things like incentives and other changes that need to happen to enable that business to kind of scale up solutions. So it's just interesting when you talk about circular economy, the different angles and places from which people come to the agenda. Sometimes that can be a little bit complicated because then it kind of washes out and becomes a kind of a little bit of a general concept. But to get to a sharper point, what I actually like to talk about more than circular economy is what Pace's vision is, which is to aim for a just and inclusive economy built on circular principles. So the goal in and of itself is not to have circularity, is to have an economic system that is just and inclusive, that serves the needs for humanity. And so then what are those circular principles that would underlie that future economy that we're moving towards? And to me, those are things about realizing sustainable consumption and production. You know, there's a lot of discussion around circularity on the production side or on the waste side, but, you know, we've got to address consumption as well, whether that's through government procurement or other areas. So it's that realizing sustainable consumption and production, respecting our finite natural resources, and ensuring that we're looking at our impacts on human and environmental well-being at the same time. These are things that are becoming very well known and commonplace, but I think we have to keep the drumbeat going, because only 5 years ago that wasn't the case. So let's keep the move going. So why does this matter? And I know Kunal, you mentioned very specifically about copper, but at even a broader level, there's about 100 billion tons of resources that go into the economy every year, 8.6% of which is recycled or used again. So 100 billion in, 8.6% recycled or used again. Now, some of that's fossil fuels and other things, but you know, there's a lot of leakage there. And if you look at population and consumption trajectories, that resource use tripled from 1970 till now, and it's looking to double again by 2050, even with all the current plans for net zero and everything else taken into account. So in essence, it's completely unsustainable. And not to mention all the kind of details on different impacts that this has. To step out and look at where circularity is, there are just a few bullet points. I'm happy to dig in more in a Q&A and just kind of keep this a little bit informal. Some of the global trends are that you can look in different regions and different localities of where circularity and momentum is moving, both on the private, public sectors, as well as in research and with kind of citizen and consumer awareness. In North America, there's a lot more growing interest. Sometimes you would hear that circularity is like a European agenda, or people who know East Asia and China and Japan more would know that the very long history that those countries have on these types of approaches. But certainly I would say there is a more global approach now. Now there are alliances of countries and companies in Africa working on circular economy. In Latin America, there's a coalition of governments. Latin America is a great example, where leading up to the COP coming up, there are currently 9 countries in Latin America that are including circular economy in their NDC, which is the commitments that they make under the Paris Agreement. They're including circular economy as a key tool to achieving their objectives. It's not consistent yet, but if you look at an innovation curve, you know, we're in a moment of moving towards a larger group of early adopters of these types of approaches. Another trend is adding to what started as a lot of a focus on materials, looks at industries and systems approaches. And I think even Kunal, you saw that in how you're framing your work, and you're thinking about your contributions in transportation, for example. So it's not just copper in the battery or copper in the vehicle. It's about what does copper mean for urbanization and transportation, and what does it mean for food systems? I know that's not relevant necessarily to this audience, but that's a big question. We're not just looking at one type of product, we're looking at entire systems. It's more complicated, but I think it will have a more staying power, because circular economy is essentially a systems, it's a way to have a systems thinking that goes beyond your product or service or where you fit into a value chain. The other trend is more heavy industry coming to the agenda, not kind of being afraid or standing back. And so we're seeing that across a few segments in heavy industry. And I'll touch on one of those, which is using kind of some different framings to think about this, and and I think we'll start seeing over the next few years, some business model innovations on the heavy industry side around materials and urban mining and material banks and traceability and other things, where you can look at different value additions and approaches, which I'm sure you know from your internal discussions a lot more than I do. And then finally, the other thing happening in this movement are links to impacts. This was kind of superficially known, often talked about, but now really looking at circularity, if it's not an end in of itself, then what is the end? There are certain strategies that are, around emissions reduction, some around economic growth or development, some around decent work. That's certainly a way to move there. And now people are beginning to emerge and thinking about the links between circularity and nature-based solutions. It makes sense superficially on, for example, on nature-based solutions, if you're producing less raw material, using less land or natural resources, therefore there's a direct impact. There's also indirect impacts along the value chain through production or consumption impacts, as well as on the end of use. So it's just to give a highlight of kind of where things are going in this movement. And I want to highlight a little bit of what we've been doing within PACE. In the last year and a half, with this coalition of around 100 organizations and 200 experts, we pulled together what we call the Action Agenda. So this is bringing together the UN Environment, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, companies, the World Economic Forum, civil society, NGOs, et cetera, to get a kind of sampling across key materials and industries. So we looked at electronics, so consumer electronics, plastics, textiles, food, and something capital equipment. So any product essentially valued over $5,000. So that way you get a little bit of a different perspective, for example, on electronics versus consumer electronics versus capital equipment. And the point was to get a clearly understood agreement on the vision. So if someone can't say what does circularity mean, they go and they look at the vision statement that says, this is where we are today in this material or in this industry, and this is where we want to be. And then we identified the barriers to getting there and got the agreement on what the priority calls to action are. So if you go to our website, pacecircular.org, you'll see the action agendas, and you can pop in pretty easy a little graph there with those kind of vision statements. I think that's actually one of the most powerful things. It's not new research. The point is to show agreement. So if you were a company or a country coming to this agenda, or you're one already working on it, you can just pick that up and know if you're in the priority areas. And it's kind of giving that leeway, and it's helped us a lot in our engagement as well. So if I just highlight two of these, because to be relevant to this group, if I just look at the consumer electronics and the capital equipment reports, like I was saying, there's some similarities, and both industries kind of serve as an important example related to copper. In capital equipment, so this manufactured products over 5,000 in value. So this is going to push you into the servers or into the EVs or other products. About 7.2 billion tons of the raw materials that I'm talking about, of the 100 million, 7.2 billion come from this type of product. And they're just, because it's from different industries, they're often not classified together. When you want to look at policies and issues when it comes to the material flows, the issues can be quite similar. On the consumer electronic side, I think Kunal gave a lot of overviews there, but this is a total market of about $1 trillion a year that's continuing to grow. And we've already seen electronics becoming the world's fastest growing waste stream, but also the fastest growing, material flow, with raw materials. So if I dig in here, I'll share what was interesting in going through this consultative process was that the vision statements came out very similar. Where do we need to go? We need products that are used and recycled, that are products that use more recycled and recyclable content, products and their components are used for longer. And then the end of use products are collected and recycled to a high standard. I think that to a high standard is the key part here. So if you go through, you'll see these 10 agreed calls to action. I'll give 3 examples where just to illustrate the types of results. One is around creating incentives for investment in recycling technologies and facilities. We can talk about all the ambitious action and other things, but if we just don't have the infrastructure in place, we've got a big problem. So what we've been trying to do is find new ways. I don't just mean blended finance or public-private partnerships. Yes, those are parts of it. But what's a way, for example, to translate the way EPR schemes have worked in Europe and find models that can work in sub-Saharan Africa? So with partners like UN Environment Program, the Global Environment Facility, Apple, HP, and others, we're testing those different models for how to diffuse these types of approaches that have worked in one country versus another. And one final one is addressing some bigger policy issues, which is on trade. So how do we get kind of some policy coherence and consistency so that we can move secondary materials across borders and around the world to enable supply chains? That's very clear. Those are issues we can't tackle alone as a company, as an industry, or as a country, but we need really intensive cross-sector collaboration there. And those are the types of issues that we pick up as pace. So thanks, and happy to cover anything through the Q&A.
Thank you very much, David. Very clear, very compelling. Just like with Kunal, we'll save Q&A time for Q&A time, so I won't ask you a direct question right now. We'll pick it up in the next stage. Thank you. I want to give the floor to Adam, Director of Rod and Bar at CDA. Who will talk to us about the urban mine from the inside, I would say. Some of the challenges, being cross-contamination that sort of obstruct the road to the mine. Adam?
Thank you, Laurent. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. So David gave some great zoomed out perspective on circular economy and some systemic connections within that. So what I wanted to do is really zoom in a little bit and really focus in on some specific technical, practical, and logistical challenges that are associated with the actual recycling part and helping us get to the place where we want to be. So if you go to the next slide, please. So some quick background on my organization, Copper Development Association. We're the not-for-profit trade association of the North American copper industry. At the most basic level, our mission is to defend and grow the use of copper. But our vision is really about bringing the value of copper and copper-based alloys to society to address a lot of challenges and opportunities that we're facing. So, naturally, the circular economy presents some very exciting prospects for copper and many other industries. But of course, it's certainly not without its challenges. So today, I really want to focus on the importance of protecting the viability of the scrap stream, and more specifically about the role and impacts of scrap contamination and some of the challenges that we're facing up and down the value chain as we try to work towards a more circular copper perspective. Okay, next slide. I wanted to set the table with some basic data here. And a lot of people know that copper is inherently recyclable. You can recycle it over and over again with no loss in its material properties. But part of the story that sometimes gets lost is that copper-based products are also made mostly from recycled content in a lot of cases. And just to give you some perspective on that, the chart I have here represents copper sources for US brass mills without wire rod. So these are companies that are making things like plumbing tube, brass rod, sheet strip, and plate. And you can see here that they get about 60% of their copper sources from scrap, recycled content. So clearly recycling is absolutely vital from a technical, but also an economic perspective for the industry. So for my comments today, I'm going to focus more on the perspective from copper alloy brass mills and fabricators, and their recycling through the direct remelting of scrap to make new products of a similar composition, rather than the smelting and refining approach that Kunal touched on earlier here. Okay, so next slide. But at the surface level, the basic recycling chain for copper and copper alloys looks relatively simple. We've got two big buckets of our new manufacturing scrap that's generated as we transform these raw materials into usable end-use products. And then we have our end-of-life waste stream, which is products that have reached the end of their service life across a huge variety of different sources like automobiles, old buildings, electronic waste, and more. So at the first step, we have to collect the scrap. And then the next important step, we have to have some separation to make sure that we separate the ferrous from the non-ferrous scrap and other additives and things so we can get useful scrap products that can be readily recycled. And then finally, we've got our metallurgical recovery, where we're actually remelting these materials and transforming them back into new products. So at a high level, it looks relatively simple, but in between some of these major steps, there's really a lot of nuances and obstacles that are really important for us to keep in mind and consider when we're talking about things like recycling rates, recycling potential in the urban mine. Okay, next slide. So a bit of a busy chart, but I wanted to show you how messy this can actually be on the receiving end when we're actually recovering some of this copper-containing scrap from the field. So this is just a high-level flow chart for a scrapyard that might be receiving metal scrap from different end-of-life streams. And you can see throughout this process, there are all sorts of tests like magnetic tests, knife tests, files, sparking tests, and even acid tests to really separate this very, very diverse and mixed waste stream into those usable metal fractions that we can readily recycle. So a pretty complicated process. And again, this is really focusing on more of the low-tech tools and instruments that are applied to separate the scrap into different fractions here. Okay, next slide. And then the final bit of background and context here, I wanted to just put it in perspective. You know, David talked about the just rapid growth of some of these different waste streams. So on the left here, we can see our new manufacturing scrap and how much copper is contained within that. So we can see that's growing slowly but steadily across a number of different industry sectors. But if you look to the right, we can see our end-of-life scrap and the amount of copper that's contained in that, and how that is just growing at a very, very accelerated rate over the coming years here. So a lot of copper captured in that urban mine, and to be able to recover that, it has to be technically and economically feasible. And those are some of the challenges that the copper industry is facing to try to maximize the recovery of copper from those different waste streams. Okay, next slide. So at one point I wanted to illustrate on the direct remelting route for brass mills is that the amount of types of scrap that these companies can use is heavily dependent on the product that they're making and the production process that they're using. And to illustrate that point, I have some simple data here from a global survey of brass mills that we completed last year. And you can see here that the companies that are making copper tube, for example, they're using a lot more of the post-consumer end-of-life scrap in their feedstock versus the folks that are making brass rod. And on the brass rod side, they tend to use a lot more of the pre-consumer industrial manufacturing scrap. So this just gives you some perspective here about, depending on the product and process that these companies are using, there are limits to the amount and types of scrap that can be used. And in direct melting, if you don't have any refining capabilities, you can only tolerate very, very clean scrap. And having contamination and things could really have a large negative impact on material properties, and even in some cases cause costly production failures that need to be avoided. So this whole concept about optimizing your blend of feedstock and the different types of scrap that you're using to make new products is absolutely vital. Okay, next slide. We think about copper scrap and recycling. You know, it's copper wire and cable and plumbing tube is a bright, shiny red metal is usually obvious and the first thing that people think about. But we can't lose sight of the fact that there's also a lot of copper wrapped up in the alloy space, and that we can add different alloying elements to copper to enhance its material properties. We can add nickel to improve strength. We can add phosphorus for corrosion resistance, silicon for wear resistance. So I like to think of this as basically a copper tree with copper at the base. And we continue to add these different alloying elements to serve the needs of many, many diverse applications and products. So from a recycling perspective, we have to consider that a lot of these different alloy compositions are not compatible for direct remelting and recycling. And we have different branches of the tree that can't be recycled with each other. And even within one particular branch, we could have alloy chemistries that we don't want to mix up in the recycling stream. So you can quickly see how this can get very complicated with trying to keep these different compositional streams separate in the recycling stream. And just for perspective, there are hundreds of different copper alloys that are used commercially out there today. Okay, next slide. And then also we need to look at the use structure. All these different alloy compositions are used in many, many different sectors, from buildings to consumer products, industrial applications, transportation. So we have all these compositions out in the field in many, many different places. And when they come back to the material loop, it can be very, very complex and complicated to try to make sure we keep these into separate streams to optimize the recycling and copper recovery there. Okay, so the bottom line here is that the brass mills, they have to be very vigilant in managing some of the inherent risks that come along with using scrap, as there's high potential for different alloying elements and contaminants to work their way into different scrap streams that are very difficult to detect. So just some of the basic impacts that we need to think about. Even at some very low concentrations, contamination in scrap can have a big impact. I mentioned degrading material properties, processing failures. We can also have very significant impacts on productivity and a high amount of operational costs that go into the front end inspection and detection of contaminants before the material is remelted. And then even employee safety issues can arise in some cases. So before I wrap up, I want to highlight two specific examples here of some challenges. For one, if we remember this copper alloy tree, and we think about the fact that a lot of these different alloys are very, very difficult to distinguish from a visual basis, it can be very hard to separate those from the recycling side. And then beyond just the different alloys and trying to keep those compositions separate, we also have to consider some complexity in product design, where it may not be an optimal configuration to separate different alloy grades before they're recycled. Okay, a quick specific example on the brasses side. A great example is we have leaded brasses that were used for many, many years before the world transitioned to more lead-free solutions for our potable water systems. But the issue is these different alloys with different compositions look almost identical in a lot of cases. So if I'm buying a truckload of water meters to remelt here and turn into a new product, and a fraction of those is made from a bismuth-containing alloy, and the other fraction is made from a lead-containing alloy, it can be very difficult to get those separated and really cause some big issues in remelting if you can't identify those. And then even within the same product, we can have components that are made from these different alloy compositions as well. Okay, so next slide. Okay, and this challenge more from a product design perspective. So on the left here, we have what's affectionately known as the copper meatball. And these are the guts of these small electrical motors that typically come out of the automotive shredding pathway in the path to recycling. So you can see we have all these copper winding wires that are mangled up together with steel and aluminum casings that can be very, very difficult to separate that copper fraction and return that to the material loop. So a particularly challenging scrap form in these copper meatballs. And then on the right, we have another product, which is copper clad aluminum, where on the outside, it looks like a traditional copper wire cable, but on the inside is an aluminum core that can be very difficult to spot because you can't see it. And introducing aluminum contamination, if you're making copper wire rod, can really be problematic, okay? Okay, to close things out here so we can have some discussion, what can we do about some of these challenges? First and foremost, we really need to increase and improve our communication and coordination between the scrap supply and the scrap demand side. You know, these industries are connected by material flows, but often they can operate somewhat independently. So it's very important for us to bridge those gaps and have really focused technical discussions about how we solve some of these challenges. A great way to do that is to continue to collect better data to make sure we really wrap our arms around some of these problems and their root causes so we can develop solutions. And one of the solutions that we can employ here in a tool that we have is standardization. We can define new scrap grades to be very clear about what elements we want or don't want in a particular stream of scrap. And we can also do a better job of trying to standardize sampling methods and other ways that we're handling these materials to make sure that we're applying these principles consistently throughout the value chain. Kunal and David touched on the fact that we need to lean into some new technology solutions. Looking at things like automated sensor-based sorting is an exciting field that's getting more market ready for the copper side. So that can help us deal with some of these much more challenging forms of scrap that are coming back here. And then really at the end of the day, one of the most effective tools we can use is just better product design and making sure that we're really putting that forethought into the products and systems that we're designing to make sure that the materials can be readily and optimally recovered at the end of their service life. Okay, so I hope that paints an interesting picture of some of the more practical and technical challenges with recycling. And I'm looking forward to some discussion and questions here with the group.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. In the little time we have available, I'll try and raise questions of, let's say, universal values. So each of you can get a chance to say a word. Many questions here refer to the incentive role that what David described as a movement can play, not just in the regions of origin, particularly in rich countries, but also in other parts of the world that may not be as wealthy and developed. And as I've got a question here, for example, which is what role could Africa play in copper recycling specifically? So I'm not sure who can respond to that. The more general question is, can companies and governments in developed nations introduce, let's say, positive change in terms of circularity in countries that currently do not prioritize this particular approach to the economy? David, Kunal, any thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a very complicated question, but there's a lot of answers as well, a lot of good answers. And so I would challenge a little bit to rethink, when you think of circularity, rethink about what countries are and think and reclassify them. So think of countries of manufacture, of origin, of raw material. Think of countries of manufacture and processing, of first use, second use, third use, and then end of use, and then recycling. And in different countries, you'll find, especially if Africa was mentioned more broadly, if you thought sub-Saharan Africa, it depends on the product, what the role of those different countries could be. But what I would say is an approach from a Northern European country is not directly replicable there. And I'll come back to that example that I was using on the EPR schemes. Ghana, Nigeria, and other countries are looking at EPR schemes. Rwanda has its own approach with electronics and recycling. Kenya is doing a good bit of work. South Africa as well. Each have a little bit of a different approach, but it's because the market is quite different. And if you think of extended producer responsibility, the manufacturing basis for consumer products are not in those countries. So that also means that the corporation structures and financing is set up differently. If your headquarters and your financial center and your manufacturing and the use are all in one country, it's quite straightforward. So thinking about how to get the private sector to partner with the governments in Nigeria, as an example, requires a different approach than, even though it's the same product and the same use case for the consumer, essentially, there's a different form of collaboration. And I think there's a role for a lot of the development banks that exist in all of these countries to play in financing or helping in the pre-financing of some of these schemes. Not necessarily to buy down the risk, but to get them moving. So to get that kind of early adoption, as well as to get the infrastructure in place. And maybe this is just a final point. I think there's a large private sector opportunity in a lot of these countries that we're talking about to be that infrastructure provider, and finding out those ways to monetize on some smaller margins or figure out the supply chains is quite interesting. And that's where we're seeing a lot of energy, is around that kind of formalized labor and kind of SMEs and startups wanting to kind of work in this space.
So this is where I would say circularity preoccupations connect perhaps with responsible production at large. So you're going to be an investor in any given market, you look at the broader set of issues, including circularity, as you look at responsible production. Okay. Val, any comment on that?
Just a couple. I think agree with everything. I think David covered it fairly comprehensively. I would maybe just say how you implement it. It's a fairly urgent challenge, right? So whether you are targeting net zero or you're targeting circular economy, reducing waste, it's a fairly urgent challenge. So you don't have decades to figure it out. So I think there are some short-term measures and then there's some long-term measures. And if you talk about countries that are more developed with respect to circular economy or recycling, certainly Europe's leading the charge in terms of some of those metrics. And then there are countries where it's not that well developed. You can do some things very short-term, and these are some of the work we're doing with the forum and the trade alliance and CEP, which is, the ideal world, we would have recycling, good, sustainable, good labor practices, environmentally conscious recycling in pretty much every country. It doesn't exist today, right? So we should be able to have what we call these green lanes. You are able to create local jobs, which are more around collection, dismantling, whatnot, and then you're somehow be able to move them over to a developed country where you can properly recycle while you work on local capacities and things like those. So I think just want to highlight that it's a huge problem. I mean, it's a big pile of the urban mine. There are things we could do now that may be more tactical while we work on more strategic things. So there's an immense opportunity in terms of jobs, environment, and whatnot. So just keep that in mind too. There's some quick fixes. Doesn't mean you're moving away from the big strategic goals, but all of that we should be doing, because every day we're not doing these, you're losing out on this opportunity.
Thanks, Kunal. Actually, one more question to you, which is, and I'm afraid we don't have much time left, but what is Glencore doing to enhance circular practices at its operating mining sites? Or is your focus only on recycling of manufactured materials?
No, I think we are focused on all of it. I think we can get into specific examples, but where possible, we are participating in recycling at our own sites. That might not be copper. It might be industrial equipment, which goes to a recycler. I would admit we are not that sophisticated to bring it specifically back. Maybe that's something we look at it in future. It's a much bigger challenge. But yes, to different aspects, different sites do conduct recycling. We, of course, are focused on how do you encourage it for the entire industry. And yes, of course, if we can recycle our own streams, we will, and we would.
Thanks. Question to you. It's a tricky one. Do you think there will be a time, Adam, when the industry makes a designation between responsibly produced scrap in a sort of copper mark type designation and scrap that was not responsibly produced? Do you think there will be a day when you'll see that?
I think it's leaning that way, certainly. I think it's very early days. I just, the challenge when you just look at the scope and scale and complexity of the scrap supply side compared to copper industry, it is a completely different animal with its own sets of challenges and opportunities to do that. I think the market will want to go there eventually, but it's a unique set of challenges that will really have to be addressed. You can have scrap aggregate up from 5-gallon buckets before it's at a scale and volume where it can be reusable. So trying to manage that at a micro level, I think will be very, very complicated in terms of traceability and transparency and everything that comes along with that. But I fully suspect there will be a demand to have responsibly sourced scrap at some point. So it's important to have that conversation now.
I mean, if I can feed in on that a little bit, is that at the larger volumes, at the product level, things like product passports that are being looked at, and they're looking at both material content as well as responsible sourcing on those types of labels and other things in different countries. I think that's going to be while we're getting to the real solution, that'll be the next step, and that's coming now.
Very good. We're of course out of time. We knew this was going to be a stretch to finish all we wanted to do within the time allocated. So I just want to thank all three of you for your contributions and your excellent presentations. I invite everyone who was on that stream to keep in touch. We'll do our best to pick up on the questions that we couldn't possibly address during the time that we had today. And thank you for coming. Wishing you all a great day, great night, great morning, wherever you're calling from. And there'll be more of this sort of events going forward organized by the ICA. So keep in touch, and all the best to all of you. Stay safe. Bye.